Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. Today we are joined by Patrick Henningsen, an American journalist, geopolitical analyst, and founder of the independent news and analyst site website 21st Century Wire. Patrick, welcome.
My pleasure. Great to be with you, Pascal.
Thank you so much for taking the time, because you actually were in Iran very recently, right? About a week before the war broke out, you came back to the US/Europe. Can you tell us a little bit about why you went there, what you saw? And you actually said having a war with Iran would be a huge mistake. Could you tell us how you came up with that assessment?
Yeah, well, thanks, Pascal. Well, let's start with that. I was there a couple of weeks before the bombs dropped. I left Iran just over a week before the latest round of hostilities resumed. And my main reason for going there is I knew that there was a small window of opportunity that could have been attacked at any moment. And the U.S. was positioning its naval assets in the Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Oman, and threats were being made by the Trump administration. And at the same time, they were doing these nuclear negotiations, which, if history is any guide, last June, that they would possibly be used as a cover for a sneak attack again.
Right.
So, and the Iranians understood that, but they're, obliged to go through the process. But we all knew, and I knew that if I went later, it might be too late. The airports might be closed, or the airport won't be there, full stop. So, and also there's a risk of being stranded there and not being able to leave if a major war started. So, and not only that, Pascal, but I realized back in December and January that the narrative of these protests that supposedly this massacre of 30,000 democratic peaceful protesters, this was so important because I realized that from previous wars that this would be used as the moral cause or the moral justification for the war, whether half the population were against it or not in America. That's really important to have that background moral argument. And they did the same thing with Saddam Hussein. They did the same thing with Muammar Gaddafi. They've done the same thing in Yugoslavia, Syria, whereby, especially under Trump, because you have to remember, Pascal, that Trump got elected, the swing vote, the independent vote, were a lot of anti-war populists, conservative. This was the part of the MAGA coalition. And whether those people were against the war, for the war, and I'll include centrist Democrats in there as well, anti-war, Democrats, liberals who are against interventions, and not just against Trump, but against war. But they would still, in America, you have to understand the psychology here. They will still say, I'm against the war, but this is an evil regime, and it's probably better that there's regime change. The world's a better place if the Ayatollah al-Khamenei is dead. And they did the same with Saddam Hussein. This was the British argument that, well, we regret the war, but as Tony Blair said, you can't argue the world's not a better place without Saddam in it. And so it's really important, that narrative. And I needed to know whether that actually happened or not. So I was fortunate enough to get access to see some of the evidence from the police there, and also to look at the damage that was done by these rioters and agent provocateurs. They burned Iranian unarmed police. The riot police don't carry weapons. They're like many riot police in Europe. They're not armed. They carry shields, billy clubs, and helmets. Many of them were burned alive. I counted 8 that I saw from the evidence, but it was really violent, these
Right.
riots.
Sorry, just I didn't. Of course, there were the riots, but when I asked you about what you saw there, I kind of forgot that you went right after the riots and
Yes.
before the war, in that window, that period of time now. So you try to investigate actually the riots. Was that the primary motivation to go?
That and also just to see what society was like, because there's 2 things. We were told that the country was on the verge of collapse and the people were rising up against the government and the country was fractured, and that all this massive massacre took place. So those were 2 things. So the first thing is I arrived on the National Day. It's like the equivalent of their Independence Day, and went straight to the center of Tehran, and there were 2 million people out on the streets supporting the government, well, all knowing that they could be bombed at any minute because the threats were already being issued by the United States. And
Right.
so I saw that massive support, that massive solidarity for the government, for the supreme leader. And you knew at that point that, that at least that part of the story was completely, in the Western narrative, is totally fabricated. And then we had time later to look at, burned buses, burned EMS vehicles, firemen, nurses killed, hundreds of police were murdered, a lot of innocent bystanders were killed as well. And police were burned alive, had petrol poured on them and then set on fire by these so-called peaceful protesters that came on the back of legitimate economic protests that came in December. With these were the merchant class, the traders and so forth, because of sanctions, because of the collapse in the currency that was engineered from the outside, by the way. And we can talk.
Which Scott
Yeah,
Bessent actually he boasted about it. He
yeah.
openly boasted, "We collapsed the Iranian economy." Ha ha ha. It's not even a secret.
Yeah, and that's we can get back to that discussion later if you want, which is this economic warfare formula that I've studied over the years, but that was carried out exactly the same formula is carried out against Syria, is against Venezuela, against Russia, not successfully, but also against obviously Cuba and some of these other countries, perennially sanctioned, North Korea, perennially sanctioned countries. Same thing happened here. For I think 10 euros, it would be equivalent of 1.5 million Iranian real. So just to go have lunch, you need 1.5 million real. So I mean, you walking around with a stack of bills like this, and I saw the same thing happen in Syria. I saw the attempt of this in Lebanon as well, because they did try to engineer a currency crash right before COVID, or right after COVID, or right around the COVID period in Lebanon. And so it's the same thing happened here. But so anyway, that was a legitimate protest, and then that was quickly co-opted and hijacked by very much by outside forces. The evidence suggests that. I also saw in Syria, where during the Arab Spring, that they had a way of ginning up mobs, and by also distributing drugs. So this is something I had seen previously in Syria and known about in Syria, and I saw the same thing here. We spoke to the police about it. There were accusations along those lines. So I mean, this is a formula, and if you look at the Maidan in February 2014, what happened there is very similar. The same type of operation was they attempted to do in Tehran, but to no success, because the society, as I learned, is totally different in Iran, and it's very resilient, and it's not what people in the West think it is.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below. And now back to the video. How does that formula work? Because okay, I see how you can from the outside create some form of social crisis. I mean, with the Maidan, it was ratcheted up. Well, allegations of corruption and mismanagement, and of course things are not going well, right? If a country is under a lot of stress, especially if the United States and Europe put their mind to it to put it under stress, then yes, things won't go well. But then in order to get from just people going to the streets, organizing a protest is actually a difficult thing, right? Because you need to get the word out, you need to organize stuff, you need to get banners, you need to have a timing, you need people to carry the banners and stuff. This all costs money and so on, and it's organization. It's an organizational effort. But then on top of that, getting violence to happen. How do you do that? I mean, with the Maidan, we know that these forces were talking to the ultra right-wing nationalist extremists. Some call them Nazis. I like to call them ultra right-wing, but whatever. And then they start shooting. But with Iran, how did they manage to get the violence in? Because I think in so societies in Europe and the US, we're just not used to this type of organizational destruction through protests.
Well, normally you have outside provocateurs, key people coming in. People are very skilled, very trained. We saw this in Homs in the early days of the Syrian destabilization, whereby you would have snipers firing into the crowd, hitting both protesters and police, or using the crowd as human shields to fire at police to get police to fire back. And this was also done in Maidan and
Yeah.
outside. Evidence suggests, and there's peer-reviewed work. I might have even um, interviewed the author of that recent book about these provocateurs and snipers, gunmen were brought in to create the fire exchange, and then it's the image from the media of the police firing back that the West will value the highest in that forming that narrative. And so this has been done many, many times. So this isn't something. This is like next level color revolution. So this is what, if you want to really escalate the color revolution, the the revolution of the roses or the orange revolution or whatever. If you want to escalate that and make it go violent, there's specific tactics that are deployed, and these were definitely deployed. It was like chapter and verse of other similar case studies that we've looked at in other countries.
But you need to fool a lot of people, right? Who you give money to and tell them, let's go and have peaceful protest, and in the end you start shooting them in the back in order to get the bloodbath you need, right? That's
Yes,
part and parcel of it, I
it's
suppose.
very sinister. Yeah, you want chaos, you want confusion, and then the U.S. and Israel tried to capitalize on this by making public calls at that time for the people to rise up and take over their institutions. I mean, imagine Donald Trump telling you to to rise up and take over the institutions. Netanyahu was doing the same. So, and then we had missions on the Israeli and American side that our intelligence services were active on the ground, and I probably think the British were as well, because there's nothing going on there that the British wouldn't also be involved in alongside the Americans. So they have pedigree in that sense. So, it's not surprising, but what the surprise that came was the fact that the Iran was able to recover and maintain order of the situation, and also intercept Starlink terminals that were sent in. They shut down the internet, and that kind of really very quickly quieted it down. And the accusations coming from the West are, "Oh, look, this dictatorial regime shuts down the internet because they're against free speech." No, well, they shut down the internet to stop the organizers that were coordinating with outside forces. And we heard Germany was a hub of organization, and my guess is that the U.S. bases there, Stuttgart and Ramstein base, and there's a large NSA station there, and so this could very well be, because when they did the Green Revolution in 2009, the United States was micromanaging that on English language Twitter at the time, and they used massive. This is before those big APIs that you can now get off the counter to manage multiple accounts. The U.S. military had already developed all that, so one person could manage 50 accounts, and that's how they helped to, let's say, accelerate the green revolution online in 2009 in Iran, and that most likely was also being done out of Germany or out of the United States directly at the time. So these things have been tried and done more than once in different countries.
Yeah, definitely. It's just interesting that it keeps working, and that it keeps also, that Western media maintains, stays online, right? They're on the narrative, and they keep following and keep falling for the same stupid pretense, like time and time again. Although I must say, the European media this time, if I compare the war now with the war against Iraq, is more critical. But still, what you just laid out, this kind of, oh, we're against the war, but you have to get rid of the mullahs, that keeps repeating, and in talk shows and so on. But do you have any indication if because there are journalists, mainstream journalists on the ground in West Asia, but
Yes.
the honest ones, what's his name, New York Times bureau chief in 20 years ago,
Oh, Chris Hedges.
Chris
Chris
Hedges. The
Hedges.
honest
Yeah.
ones then leave, right? They go out and they become Chris Hedges, and report honestly about what actually happened. But the others, how do they stay in line? And do you have any indication of how they think about this? Do they believe this stupid narrative, or are they willingly complicit?
Well, while I was there, it was interesting. There were three mainstream journalists that were there at the same time I was there. One from the BBC, and one from Sky News, and Richard Engel, and the BBC reporter, and then I think Freddie Plykin from CNN, who actually has been doing pretty decent, objective journalism for CNN. So he's one of the better ones, I think. But the BBC reporter at the same national rally day that I was at, the BBC put out this report of people chanting death to the regime. And I'm like, where is this taking place? Because it's definitely not taking place out here. So maybe they found some group of people, or they assembled some situation, or I don't know. But Richard Engel is quite a journeyman. He used to work for NBC. He got caught in a scandal in Syria where they sort of faked a kidnapping. I don't know if you remember reading about that years ago, but these are sort of veteran kind of, let's say, information warfare veterans in the mainstream. So I don't want to get into his reporting. It's pretty amazing, but so they managed to slide into these situations, these mainstream people, and some of them are, it's just about on the edge. And I guess Iran can kind of tolerate that to some degree, but I mean, I think the patience is wearing thin. Russia doesn't even entertain some of these people anymore because they're just putting out absolute fabricated reports sometimes. But they're still allowed, they still allow the BBC correspondent in Moscow or Matthew Chance from the CNN to roam around and do the usual thing. But I think that people are getting wise to the reporting because there is a good variety of sources to look at and compare, and they just realize what the mainstream are pushing. Their track record is just so horrendous, especially in a war situation. Then you start seeing the real propaganda come. When the shots start firing and what hits the fan, then you'll just wait and you can see who's really going to go for it and push some of the most egregious propaganda. And sometimes you see the usual suspects doing that. But this one's different, Pascal. And a couple of CNN reporters leaked or reported that Trump and the CIA were arming Iranian Kurds that were over the border in the KRG, Iraqi Kurdistan, and saying this is going to be problematic for Trump, and this is like almost preempting. And Clarissa Ward was pushing that out on her personal social media account, and she does incredible propaganda in war zones over the years. And I was just like, wow, why are they doing this now? This could compromise potentially the covert action by the Trump or the CIA to arm these Kurdish proxies and send them into Iran to wreak havoc and destabilize the region. So, like, is this an anti-Trump thing in the United States? Are these journalists that are somehow had an epiphany and they're actually doing real journalism? It's really difficult. Or is it the change of ownership at CNN? I don't know. But we saw, I think Natasha Bertrand and Clarissa Ward put out that story. And I was shocked because, they've always been regime change, queens of regime change, and, propaganda warriors for the Pentagon, essentially, over the years. And somehow we saw a break of ranks in parts of the mainstream coverage of this conflict that I have never seen before in my lifetime. So that's a new thing.
Is it possible that we're seeing here not a conflict of interest, but a conflict of neocon conscience of people who do want this war, but on the other hand, they just can't be moved to completely support Trump because they are at heart with the other side of the Uni Party?
I think so. I think there's probably even a split at the intelligence level. We've seen the resignations recently of Joe Kent. So there's not a unanimity of thought in the United States and Washington on this. Definitely, maybe within the White House, the inner circle of Trump and the Republican Party is pretty much a whip line. But outside of that, even there's some people that are setting themselves up as dissenters on this. Even Chuck Schumer is like trying to backpedal. The Democratic minority Senate leader is trying to backpedal and basically saying this war is unlawful and we should have invoked the War Powers Act. A little bit too little, too late, in my opinion, because they could have pushed that before the war. They could have had that vote before the war, but Democrats were sandbagging, including Chuck Schumer. But now they're coming out trying to position themselves as, against Trump's illegal war, and so it's just politics as usual. But no, I think there's definitely dissenting opinions and people among the ranks. I believe you will see more resignations, high-profile resignations, the more this situation drags on.
So, how are you interpreting the situation? I mean, on the one hand, you could argue this is the war the neocons always wanted. On the other hand, you could say that maybe this is Plan B or Plan C. If you start with Plan A being the 12-day war, that kind of didn't work. Plan B being the the January riots that were supposed to get rid of the regime and didn't work, and now we're in Plan C. Or you take the approach of the interpretation of Brian Berletic, who is like, no, this has always been the goal. There's no concrete plan. There's just always push, break, and the chaos that we're seeing is not the unintended consequence. It's not Trump screwing up. It is exactly what was intended for not just Iran, but the entire region, because it destabilizes not only them, it also impedes the further development of China, and it benefits the United States. So the entire chaos is actually wanted. How do you interpret this?
I mean, there's different ways that you can look at this, depending on which way you're leaning. I mean, myself, I'm American. I'm here right now, and I'm in America. I vote as well, and so I'm part of the political process, even though I'm a journalist. So I have to, it. You have to ask yourself the question: is what if this is some grand master plan? Can someone explain to me what is in America's interest that we are witnessing that's unfolded in the last 3 weeks? Because I personally cannot see it. Even with the neoconservative period, that unipolar moment in the from the late 1990s, post 9/11 to the Iraq War. Many people will look at that and say, well, that was just what exactly did the U.S. gain from Iraq and that whole decade, that complete debacle? Yeah, some corporations definitely got rich. Some people, Balfour Beatty, Halliburton, all of these corporations, rebuilding Iraq, the military-industrial complex, yeah, they all got rich. And Afghanistan, same thing. It kept NATO out of area and relevant. But, in the long term, it really damaged NATO and the United States' efforts there. So if we look at this situation, how this has been carried out, the U.S. has alienated all of its allies. It's now lost such incredible amount of credibility. You have to understand the source of U.S. power post World War II. It's through the international institutions. It's through the multilateral institutions by leveraging their relationships, the trust through these institutions. Whether the U.S. would follow international law or not is beside the point. We can get into that discussion. There's two tiers of international law. Obviously, people who say that, oh, international law is dead, so just forget about it. That's not true. The United States and Israel and Britain might not follow it, but the rest of the world does, and they have to. It's the only way.
They demand that we follow it. So yeah, I'm absolutely with you on that one. Yeah,
You have to, and because otherwise it's chaos. And who's going to reign supreme in a chaotic environment? In the realist sense, that would be the rogue hegemons. So the mid-tier and lower-tier powers have to bandwagon together, and international law, that framework, is essential because Iran's a perfect example. It's a different society. They have a different constitution. They're religious. The religion and faith is at the absolute core and the center of their political economy. That's not the same as in the United States. That's not the same as European countries. So you need an intermediary system or a network that countries can communicate and do dispute resolution. And that is the international system. Whether the US has trashed it or not, it exists so that different countries can meet in the middle, that there's some common framework, diplomatic and etc. So
and they will meet, just to throw that in there. Just because Israel blows up a consulate in the Iranian consulate in Damascus and breaches international law hugely, right? And a basic kind of very, very horrible infringement of the Vienna Convention and so on. That doesn't mean that suddenly Armenia and Azerbaijan are going to blow up their consulates around the world. I mean, Japan doesn't do it to China. China doesn't do it to Portugal, and so on. It's like, no, the system remains in place. It's just you've got a criminal over there who's kind of manages to get away with it, but that doesn't invalidate the system.
Absolutely. It doesn't invalidate diplomatic successes over the years. Even U.S. have brokered some diplomatic successes. Like, for instance, the JCPOA, it was just a double insurance policy to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon that they weren't developing anyway, but it was it's a double layer of insurance. And, some people will point to the Brookings Institute paper in 2010, Which Path to Persia, and point to a specific passage in there and say, oh, look, they plan to pull the rug on POA and then blame it on the Iranians. This was the plan all along. Well, listen, it took 2 years to put that deal together. It had guarantors, Russia, the P5+1, all the European countries, the United States. Okay, a lot of people sunk a lot of political capital into that deal to make it work, and it did what it was intended to do. It stabilized the situation, and it turned the alarm down, and it lifted sanctions on Iran and so forth. Now, what you have to also remember is this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Look at who funds the Brookings Institution. Some of the biggest Zionist Israeli donors.
Right.
So you might think you're reading U.S. policy, but there's something behind it. People don't throw. The Israeli lobby put $600 million into the last election cycle in the Republican side, just Republican campaigns, including the White House. So 600 million, that's over $500 million. Unprecedented sums of money have been injected into the U.S. political system. Do you think that doesn't have consequences? Do you think they're doing that just for fun? Do you think they don't want anything in return? I mean, you really have to be living in complete denial to not realize how, maybe when the state of Israel was created by the British, and it was definitely an imperial outpost. It was a beachhead for Anglo imperial aspirations to, as part of the Great Game, also, the control of oil flowing through the Suez Canal, etc. And then the Americans took the custodianship over the state of Israel, I would say after the Suez Crisis. That's when that phase began. And so the important point of this is, yes, that is the tail and not the dog. The U.S. empire is the dog, but over time, over 50 or 60 years, that tail has grown into something massive and has metastasized and is threatening the health of the dog at this point, because it's just the level of penetration, as John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, and others have proven over the years, and which has now reached proportions way beyond what Mearsheimer and Walt had in their 2007 book on the Israeli lobby. Right. We're at way higher levels now in terms of influence and the money that's injected in there. And so what you're seeing, the U.S. imperial policy has something behind it. And that thing behind it is in the Clean Break document. It's interwoven into the neoconservative movement, and it's absolutely surrounding this White House. Do you realize that the Israeli lobby handpicked every cabinet member of the Trump administration that touches national security or foreign policy? That's what 600 million buys you. And policy equals people equal policy in American politics. So you can't just brush that aside and say that that's nothing. And I'll give you proof for that, Pascal, because and I I haven't written extensively on this, but I've spoken about it. And if you look at the history of U.S. cabinets, normally a president will select out of the diplomatic corps, the civil service, academia, previous diplomats will be selected for cabinet positions because anybody can perform a cabinet duty. It doesn't need to be a senator or a congressman. So why is it that Donald Trump is the first president in history that would raid his own party's House seats, raid his own party's Senate seats, safe seats, like long-term safe seats, career seats? These are senators and congressmen that would be there till they die, like Nancy Pelosi. And Trump would pull them out and risk losing that seat. Why? Why would he do that when anyone could fill those positions? And the reason is, and what we discovered in the last election cycle, and this is admitted by IPAC, is that they were grooming all of those congressmen and senators from their first election. They already had established relationships. They have control over them in a way that they wouldn't someone out of academia or civil service. The lobby had groomed them with campaign contributions, checks, all sorts of perks from day one, whether they won or lost their first election. They're there. And so that's why those were the short lists that were given to Howard Lutnick and Jared Kushner, two pro-Israeli loyalists, especially Kushner. They managed the transition team for Trump's cabinet. And so Mary Adelson had a hand, as did the big donors, probably Ronald Lauder and others. And so you're looking at this has never happened in U.S. history. For once, and I'll prove that's the case, is because one of the biggest donors to the Obama administration in 2008 was Wall Street, and Citibank gave the short list for Obama's cabinet, and nearly to a man, what Citi list presented as a list became Obama's cabinet. And that's
that was when Larry Summers became the Treasury Secretary, wasn't it? 2008.
That would have been possibly Timothy Geithner.
Well, Timothy Guy.
That might have been Tim Geithner, and Hank Paulson as well was. And so I have to go back and review.
But okay.
That.
So you basically, I mean, yeah, I mean the donors hand in the short list. Yeah, makes good sense.
So that's the tail has grown out of control, and that tail is absolutely wagging this dog. And there's 100 different ways you could have contained Iran if the goal was dominance. And the U.S. is now given up its footprint around the Persian Gulf. It will not be able to maintain the military dominance and positioning it has previously because of what it's done, the massive risk, the recklessness of this undeclared, unprovoked war of aggression with Israel. And I can't see, if it's about U.S. empire, I think they've done themselves more damage abroad and at home as a result of what we've seen. So I can't see how that's in the master plan of American imperial dominance. I think this is something else we're looking at here.
Yeah, I'm very glad you're making these points because, the argument by Brian Berletic, who, by the way, I tried to get on my show for a long time, but I just can't get to him, unfortunately. But I take that very, very seriously because I think he tries to point out that there is, even if there's not a teleological kind of approach, it's like there are plans, there are policy papers that spell this out, there are people who spell it out, and then there are downstream actions that start matching what happened back then. So we do have a stream of kind of direction, right? On the other hand, we lack this kind of master planning, yes, and the nefarious people in the room who then do all the puppeteering. But we do see that some of these attempts are being made, right, at the puppeteering, and but it is a feedback loop, right? And it's not the first time that empires hand over power from the Brits to the Americans, and former terrorist groups, which really, I mean, the current government of Israel is just the outgrowth of a couple of terrorist organizations back in the 1920s and 30s who attacked the Brits. They blew up British hotels in Palestine, right? And then they morphed, and they became useful, and they were put into power. And that's also not the first time we see that. I mean, right now Syria is being run by by somebody who was once searched as a terrorist with 5 or 10 million bounty on his head, right?
Yes.
And so this
Yes.
is kind of something that happens time and again, and that then these power structures between the tail and the dog start changing. So is it that one? And at the moment we're just at peak tail power.
Well, yes, yes. I mean, look, people want to make this a binary argument. It's got to be one or the other. I think it's both. I think
Yeah,
it's Israel and the U.S. is a symbiotic
yeah.
relationship that the U.S. is quite happy for Israel to pursue its greater Israel ambitions and its regional dominance there. And at the same time, this could come at the detriment of U.S. power and influence and globally, and it could mark the end of the U.S. empire in exactly the same way. The Suez Crisis, which was completely ham-fisted, the British, the French, and the Israelis, that plot that was later exposed, but that was the end of British dominance and control, and over the Middle East. And from that point, everyone had to go through the United States. So the U.S. and the Soviet Union asserted themselves in the Suez Crisis, and that changed the world order effectively from that point forward. And we're in that same paradigm now. But what we're seeing here in Iran with the Persian Gulf, this is now in that sense. I'm not going to say it's exactly the same, but you have China and Russia somewhat playing a similar role, at least symbolically, in terms of power distribution that the Soviet Union and the Americans played versus the old empire, the old world order, which was the British and the French in the Suez Crisis in '56. So I'm talking about power shifts here, not specifically the exact roles that they played in those. And Gamal Abdel Nasser was definitely not the same as the Iranians, although he was a revolutionary government that the West did not know how to manage, and the Americans were scared that he was going to bolt for the Soviets, and they were also terrified of Arab nationalism. And so there are some similar themes there. By the same token, the situation in Iran is largely what we're seeing now in Iran. Previous iterations are basically American interventions and British interventions that created the current government, that created the Islamic Revolution. Because you have to remember, forget about the coup in '53. Everybody knows that's very more or less straightforward if you're analyzing it as a coup, the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh and the installation of a fake monarch, a despot, the Shah of Iran. But what happened at the end of '79 is actually more interesting, because at that time, under Jimmy Carter, the Americans were terrified that the Iranians would go in a communist direction or a socialist direction, and that they would immediately ally with the Soviet Union, and that was just a no-go. So the U.S. preferred an Islamic government, a right-wing, let's say conservative right-wing Islamic, over a left-wing. It was a miscalculation by the U.S. on many levels, but that was their thinking, and they were already backing sort of Wahhabi mujahideen next door in Afghanistan, which they were also using for the same reason, by the way, because of the emergence of very credible and strong left-wing governments in Afghanistan through the 1970s. So this was the thinking of the U.S. at the time. And it obviously backfired on them, or didn't, depending on which way you want to analyze it. But definitely, I don't think it was the intended result. And I think the reason is because I don't think Americans and British or Europeans appreciate how deep this civilization in the society and the religious element in Iran, it goes so deep. You're talking about, just on the Islamic side, centuries, but beyond that, with the Persian identification of the people there, that's a 5,000-year-old civilization. But especially with the Islamic revival of Shiite intellectualism, of this new type of political Islam that emerged out of 1979, that then spread globally and had a big effect in Pakistan next door as well. And Americans aren't going to appreciate this, and I'll tell you the reason why, Pascal, is because Americans and Westerners, they're cynical. They don't think that that a government would say, put in their constitution that they must defend the oppressed. They would think, no, they're just evil mullahs because, and every government's corrupt. Nobody would put that at the center of their constitutional raison d'etre or raison d'etat. No, but Iran does. They're the real deal in that sense. But the West won't accept that. They'll say, no, no, no. They're just doing that, and what their defense of the Palestinians is cover for anti-Semitism, and it's because they hate Jews and they want to push Israel into the ocean. That's the cynicism of the West, because we have lost connection with some of these deep themes and these deep purposes in the West, that we project our cynicism on everybody else. In the same way that we have such low standards for our political leaders now in the West, we project that same standard for everybody else, and it's not true. Other countries have very high bar for what they will accept as the leader of their country. Russia's a good example. So that's one of the differences, and the West will never. I don't think we're capable in the West of grasping some of these concepts anymore. I think previous generations more so, and definitely the British understood probably a lot of these things back when they had a Arab Camel Corps, as they called it, in the Foreign Office. But today, the 21st century, I just don't see it in any of the words or commentary coming out of the West.
These are very, very good observations that you made. And maybe the first one is also about maybe the connection between 79 and 89, Iran and Afghanistan. It's like I had a very interesting talk with David Gibbs, who a professor at Arizona University, who pointed out that the United States, right before the Soviets actually invaded Afghanistan, they backed actually the communists, because they were the ones who held the most power in Afghanistan and had the most potential for upsetting the Soviets, to the point where the Soviet communists told the Afghan communists, tone it down. Your revolutionary stuff is getting out of hand. And well, that's one thing. On the other, then of course the involvement of the CIA in 79 and backing. I mean, the Iranian Revolution, if you want to dumb it down, was like two factions coming together: the religious faction and the young student revolutionary, rather left faction, right? And one over the other, and then massacred them as well. So there's probably a story to tell about this one as well. And then of course the war, the manufactured war, in which we today know the US sold weapons to both sides, Iran and Iraq, and and then later on how this entire spiel continues. It's just the level and the sophistication actually of the United States of being able to do these clandestine and covert actions and working on the ground with large sums of money, and then actually having influence within these societies abroad. That one, I do think, is kind of unmatched and probably unparalleled, I would argue, in history. Or how do you see that one?
I think so. I think the other factor that's important, and all those things you said are key factors in this. But the other thing is, there, if you look at, let's compare the Islamic government in Iran. Okay, it's a revolutionary government. It's a dynamic government. It's a living government. That's 47 years, still has maintained its vigor after 47 years as a revolutionary government. Okay, and we look at similar with the Bolivarian revolution as well, Venezuela particularly, but we put Bolivia in that category up until recently as well, and also the Ba'athist system between Iraq and Syria. The U.S. and the West and Israel had a very hard time subduing and cracking. It took them decades, many failed coups, many wars, many proxy wars, in order to, they say, achieve the result we saw in Damascus at the end of 2024. It's not easy. These are anti-hegemonic. These were the basis of Bolivarian governments, or the basis of Ba'athist governments, or the Iranian revolution, Islamic revolution, is anti-hegemonic. It's a government in process that needs to become independent. They tend to be conservative. They also tend to be not anti-modern, but maybe you could say by today's standards, Iran is very anti-woke by today's Western definition. They're extremely—
That's a bad way of putting it.
they're very anti-woke. They're conservative, but also that is independent, sovereign. very important. Iranians are fiercely sovereign, fiercely. So when they're under sanctions, they went immediately for import replacement, and there was no hesitation whatsoever. And so and also in today's world, if you're not energy independent, then you have to cede a certain percentage of your sovereignty. And so Iran is energy independent. The point of their nuclear program, civilian program, was because of sanctions on oil, was because they realized that their oil or their gas could be taken offline in a war, and they needed to hedge in order to provide the base load for the power to run the country. So that's it wasn't necessarily to develop nuclear weapons, but that's what the West is projecting. But now you can see from the strategy of what Israel and Trump are doing, threatening to destroy society by hitting their power stations, by taking their energy infrastructure offline. That's the end game, because when you do that, you then can weaken a country to such a degree. Look at Cuba. Cuba is completely energy import dependent on fuel, and the United States has closed off all of the sort of exit doors or entrance doors into Cuba, and they're strangling it. Look at Germany as a good example. Germany had a nuclear power fleet up until a few years ago, and through this very odd co-opting of the Green Party and the climate movement, and at post Fukushima, shut down their nuclear power plants because of safety risks. Now, modern nuclear power plants are relatively safe, especially some of the newer fleet. So this idea that Germany could fall by the wayside in the way that Japan did after Fukushima is just not really a credible argument. Plus the fact that Japan is on a fault line as well, and has tsunamis and things like that, earthquakes. It just so why is that? So now you didn't know in 2010. Then the Nord Stream pipeline came online, and that was a direct natural gas supply to Germany from Russia. And then you had the magical Nord Stream sabotage. And at that point, where's Germany? Well, Germany's now forced to buy its LNG from the United States at way over market prices. But not only that, they're then firing up their coal plants. And guess what? And they have to pay carbon indulgence taxes for coal. So that's keeping the carbon market buoyant in there. But why would it? It's just national suicide. Why an industrial powerhouse like Germany would shut down its nuclear plants? Now look at Iran. Now you can see this is a strategy. I believe the strategy was to take Germany down. The United States wanted to pull it down a notch, weaken the EU, and make it totally dependent on U.S. energy. And they're attempting to do the same thing in other countries. And I believe that if the U.S. had its way, it would force Iran, if they weren't going to give over their hydrocarbon industries, then they would destroy. The U.S. and Israel would destroy them and force them to import energy, right, and import everything. And that is the model of colonial dependency or neo-colonial dependency. But it's back to what we were saying previously: sovereignty, energy independence gives you sovereignty, and those countries like Syria, Arab nationalist countries, revolutionary governments are fiercely sovereign, and that's when they come into clash with other powers like the United States, like Israel, who has regional domination plans. Israel wants to create a city-state in the vein of historic city-state empires, and have total control over commerce and trade flows through that part of the world, and then demilitarize all of their neighbors and have them completely subservient to West Jerusalem. Yeah. Yes. And that's the plan. And they're very open about that now. You can see they're getting very cocky. Israeli high-level officials, they're bragging about ethnic cleansing. And look at what they're doing in Lebanon right now, in South Lebanon. I mean, that should at least be as bad or worse. I mean, what Russia did in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, it's nothing. And not to mention, Russia was just reacting to the collapse of UN Security Council Resolution 2202, which was the implementation of the Minsk Accords. That's what they were reacting to, a civil war situation. This is just blatant barbarism by Israel, and they're doing it in broad daylight, and nobody is restraining them. And the United States is adopting the Israeli doctrines now, which is the other thing that's dangerous, Pascal,
Yeah.
is that we used to have this assumption that civilians in densely populated areas would not be targeted indiscriminately with modern military power, and that is no longer an assumption that's factored into war games anymore, because
No.
after October 7th, and the U.S. is now adopting the Dahia doctrine of Israel. So again, that merger of the U.S. and Israel in terms of the military doctrines, and it's kind of it's happening, you know.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and no. On the no part, I would say that if you look at the way the United States was fighting its wars in the past, I don't think we can find a moment when they seriously constrained over a prolonged time the bombings of civilians. I mean, Second World War, Germany and Japan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, they didn't even
Korea.
try. They didn't, and
Yeah.
Korea, they don't even try to hit the military installations. They go after the city centers, right, in order to achieve goals. And
I would say
Vietnam,
to
we've seen it
yeah, post Vietnam, Pascal, after
post
Vietnam.
Vietnam.
Yeah, I would say Vietnam to Dresden, that was a different, that's just brutal savagery, and medieval style siege warfare. And we had some level of restraint post Vietnam,
Right.
whereby, and the U.S. they retooled their doctrine to rapid strike forces, air power, special forces, Donald Rumsfeld's doctrine. So the U.S. predicated all of its sort of military interventions based on that model: cruise missiles, standoff munitions. But now, with Trump, uh,
Yeah, it's
is that the way it's going to be, or are we going back to the previous now?
I mean, this absolutely huge test is, of course, going to be on whether the U.S. Israel, and they are the same at that point, if this entity is going to use nuclear weapons, because whether Israel uses it or the United States, it's going to happen with the okay of the other one. That's for sure, right? So
Yes.
if they use nukes, then again, we are in. We must assume that the US goes from a strategy of trying to defeat the other one to annihilate the other one, and the war of annihilation then will have the forms of what happened in Gaza, because Gaza is an
Yes.
annihilation and extermination mission, which works according to a different logic, also because it obviously doesn't leave any more room for the target of annihilation to negotiate, right? So
Yeah. Annihilation. That's the word. That's the key word. Annihilation.
but attempting to annihilate a nation of 90 million people seems to me too crazy, even for this person in the White House. However, let me just, for the last couple of minutes we have, ask you this question, because it's been bugging me for a couple of days now. Who do you think Donald Trump's tweets are? I realized the other day that his tweets, his social media posts, are relatively long, and they do not contain spelling errors. In his first term, there were tons and tons of spelling errors through his tweets. That what tells me that he wrote them himself. Now he doesn't, or they're being at least redacted. Right? Who do you think the Trump tweet team is?
It's definitely more than one person, and they would definitely have a little committee. I would say that committee is probably very much on the same wavelength in terms of their
Must
thoughts and beliefs, and that would include Stephen Miller, and people like this. And in his first term, he had different people putting out tweets, and now he has his own platform called True Social, which,
yeah.
at the
I mean
moment,
that one, yeah. Truth
yeah,
social.
at the moment, he's using his social media account, in my opinion, just to mess with the markets, because you look at the announcement he did
Sure.
earlier on Monday this week. He said that, yeah, I've got a meeting. We're going to have talks with the Iranians and so forth. Right away, you saw the S&P 500 jump to market cap of 2 trillion. And then the Iranians come a couple hours later and deny and say, we haven't spoken to Trump. What the hell is he talking about? And the market crashed back down again. It lost a trillion in market cap. And so if you're smart and you're doing your call options before the announcement, You can make a lot of money on the surge, and you can make money on the dip afterwards, and then it rebounds a little bit again afterwards. And so all this talk about retaking the Straits of Hormuz without a concrete plan, it makes me think, Pascal, that there was no plan, and he's doing this to either shore up the oil markets to have a little more value come back in to prevent the price from spiking too much. But there's also the people are making a lot of money off this in Wall Street, and I think there's insider trading going on. I think it's happening at the White House level, and I think that is probably, when this is all said and done, if we survive as a human race, we will see some horrific insider trading using the markets between Trump's announcements, and also Polymarket, and these betting sites are just insane. The stuff that's going on.
I
Betting
read
on.
the other day somewhere on social media that Congress made an exception for themselves when it comes to insider trading. Is that true? Can congressmen and senators do inside trading without being without punishment being able to be handed out?
I think they do, but this is a different type of insider trading, because it would be at policy level, so and the executive level, because when everyone knows when Trump puts something out on social media, there's going to be a reaction to it, and the market's going to react. And right now, the markets are so tense, especially with regard to oil price and some of these commodities in the energy sector, also the helium in the AI, the semiconductor, all of this stuff is in the fertilizer, big ag. This is all affected with the Straits of Hormuz. So any announcement by Trump can totally create tremors in the market, one way or the other. And if you know in advance what's happening and what's going to be said, you can ride that wave and make an ungodly sum of money if you're able to put the types of bets that people at Wall Street institutions are able to do. And I think this is happening.
Oh my God, uh, wouldn't it be even more insulting if in the end it turns out it's not about geostrategy, it's not about Israel, it's just about gambling on a global scale.
I
Anyhow,
mean, there,
but all of these things obviously come together. It's just difficult to say like which factor influences which others. But Patrick, that was very, very interesting. Thank you very much for the insights that you shared with us. Um, People who would want to find your work, where's the best place to go?
the main hub is 21stcenturywire.com. That's my website and our media platform. We've been going since 2009. And also, I'm a co-anchor on the UK Column News, which is a sort of, really well-established UK alternative media outlet on Fridays. I'm their anchor there. Plus, I have a show on Sunday called The Sunday Wire, which is kind of a week wrap-up of a lot of these stories as well. But yeah, 21stcenturywire.com, you'll find everything there. And I'm on Substack as well, patrickhenningsen.substack.com. So, there's links. We can drop those links in the description, whatever.
Yeah. If you send me the links in an email, then I'll just copy paste and I put them into the description box of this video below, and we will certainly have you back to talk again. Patrick Henningsen, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure. Great to be with you, Pascal.